much. I have the great pleasure to present Don Aliberti for this session here for the New York Information Security Meetup / the Cyber Guild. And it's we're doing this at noon today. It's a reschedule because of due to inclement weather that we had this past couple of days. So I'm glad to see, Don, that you have your power back on and we're able to have this session. So welcome all. Feel free to enter questions during the chat, and we'll cover them if we can. If we have the time for it, we're looking to spend the next 40 to 45 minutes just having a casual conversation. So Don, how are you today?
Good, Dave. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for organizing these meetups. It's definitely a great initiative. Excited.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's the reason? It's part of me giving back to the community, and I always tell people that very rarely you can come over and knock on your door and say, hey Don, can we spend a few minutes, can I pick your brains for a few minutes? You're a busy guy, you're running a lot of things simultaneously, you typically run a team and have a lot of responsibilities, and you just can't possibly cater for the kind of the everyday security professional wants to pick your brain. So maybe we can kind of start with a sense of how your career progressed, and maybe kind of start at the beginning, how you got exposed to technology, and then how you got into the security space.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I started quite a number of years ago, right? I have degrees in computer science and computer engineering. Kind of started more on the technical end. I wrote some compilers, some operating system, some chip level protocols. When I was at Bell Labs, it's kind of interesting too. Made me kind of think a little bit about this whole Spectre meltdown vulnerabilities we had recently when I was working on that in that space. I mean, believe it or not, it was back 1988, 89, 90 time frame. That's when all these kind of pipelining of instructions kind of came into play. And now you could see, right, it took someone 20-something years before they figured out a way that they could actually exploit that to be able to read information from memory. So it's kind of interesting. And at that point, I was working in microelectronics. I was more in the kind of the low-level software space. And then I changed jobs and I started working for Network Services Division as part of AT&T. And that's where I kind of jumped into security. I remember the specific date. It was January 15th, 1990. So what happened is there was a hacker group in Texas that was threatening to take down the AT&T network on a national holiday. And sure enough, the network came down on Martin Luther King's birthday. And everyone thought that it got hacked into. And this was before, security was a priority per se. And it ended up not being a hack. It ended up being a bug in the software, a switching software that got passed and looked like a worm going through the network on the heels of the Morris worm. So they put together a task force to address security of the network. I had access to all the switches. I was writing commands to try to build an expert system to manage the switches and to restore traffic. And I got put on the task force, right, to kind of build security into our development process, kind of shift left type of thing. So fast forward at this point, 30 years, I'm still working in the security space. So it wasn't a planned thing per se, and it just kind of happened, that I was in the right place at the right time, and it ended up being a good career choice.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And then you spend quite the past several years in very senior roles for specifically financial institutions, right? Yeah. Dealing with some major infrastructure and cybersecurity areas. So, and it's really fascinating. You brought in a kind of a bug or exploit that has been around for 20 odd years, and now just recently kind of got discovered. Do you think that there's any other underlying bugs that are kind of lurking behind the scenes that we don't know about, and just been kind of uncovered through pure luck sometimes, right? Do you think that there are a couple more of these?
There needs to be. This is an interesting one because it was more at the hardware level, right? It was the chip design level that someone could potentially take advantage of. But at one point, this was a number of years ago, when I was at Citi, we were putting together some emerging risks, right? So, Android operating systems, smartphones, and things started coming into play. And if you look at the statistics, the number of bugs per line of code, and then you look at the number of line of codes in something like an Android operating system, forget about the applications that run on top of it. I mean, there has to be a lot of things that haven't been detected there, right? And that's what people came up with, the whole concept of fuzzing, right? So it's a method that you just kind of throw all unexpected sets of data at the code and see how it reacts to it, right? Does it handle these kind of fringe cases, borderline cases well? Does it kind of recover well, or does it do something that you wouldn't expect? Because often what people will do is you'll test against your use cases, which are the things that should be working well or working well, and you don't have the inverse that you test that every other scenario, for these cases that it doesn't work correctly.
Yeah, and what also interesting about specifically what you mentioned is that you have a very technical background. Mm-hmm. You came in from a very technical space, right, and kind of advanced into kind of management roles. Do you still keep up with the technology today, on your day-to-day activities, or is it hard for you?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, unless you do something, hours and hours, a day, a week, type of stuff, it's hard to keep your skills up. I think I have a pretty strong foundational knowledge of how computers work and, where some of the vulnerabilities may be based on where I came from. But one of the things that I did at Citi as well is when they built out the Fusion Center, I helped set up a malware reversing lab because I had some background in compiler design, right? So I understood assembly language, and I kind of actually had a certificate in reverse engineering. But I would never call myself a reverse engineer. I went to some class for 4 or 5 days, 3-4 days, and I took something at Black Hat, and I could kind of work my way around it. But unless you do something day in and day out, and you're really kind of picking up the methods that the adversaries are using, all the kind of tricks of the trade, that's where you really become an expert. So yeah, I think I have some technical background to understand things, but I was way, way, way more technical, 25 years ago or 20 years ago than I am today.
Yeah, and so you mentioned, Citigroup, but you mentioned some others. These are mega, financial institutions, right? Mm-hmm. And with mega budgets, right? We're talking about, Citigroup in particular has, budget of probably a small country, to spend on tech.
So you heard that story, okay?
Yes. So what's your day-to-day activities look like, as somebody who's responsible for, for security? How do you interface with others? Like, what are kind of the top priorities? I know it's a number of questions in one, but maybe you can kind of give us a glimpse of what that kind of day-to-day activities look like for you, and what's important when you work with some very large financials.
Yeah, I've had different roles in different companies. I mean, I sort of advertised it as CISO. So when I was at Nomura, which was my last gig, I was the U.S. CISO, right? The NYDFS kind of pressed organizations to identify a key person that's responsible for security, and I was the most senior person in the security space. I got the quote unquote CISO title. So a lot depends on the organization, right? What kind of business they're in, what their exposure is, right? So if you're for a credit card company, if you're for Citigroup's a lot different than Nomura, which is a wholesale bank. So I think the day-to-day role really depends. And the more operational the role, the larger the presence from a customer base, from an internet application exposure perspective. Probably you spend a lot more time on operational issues, whether they're security issues or just things are slowness or a server down and that type of thing. So as I transitioned into Santander, I had a more operational role. So my breakdown of my day-to-day activities changed a lot. A lot more was just kind of monitoring, keeping the lights on, and then you have projects to improve things over time, as opposed to Nomura, there was less of that. and more of it was a bit more measurements, management reporting, strategy, right? They were in a 3 to 5 year kind of maturity curve and looking to introduce new technology. So a lot really depends on the individual's role, what the breakdown would be, and the firm.
Mhm. And when you join a new role, you mentioned kind of the difference between operational roles and non-operational roles. What's your 30, 60, 90 days look like? And let's say in the next role, you come in, you establish, report with the folks. What is your kind of the first 3 months for it look like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I did change jobs a couple of times in the last 6 years. So believe it or not, there's a lot of books in this space, right? There's a lot of background and you can kind of read and get other people's opinions. And actually, I was looking at LinkedIn this morning and something popped up with Jeremy Grossman, volume 2 from Sentinel-1, the first 90 days of being a CISO. So if you're interested in other people's opinion, it looks like Sentinel-1 is doing a series of interviews with folks on this. But what I learned is don't rush it. You do have what typically they call the honeymoon period, type of thing, and you should be spending at least 50% of your time observing, right, and learning the organization, learning where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are, as opposed to trying to rush right in and do, right. So about 50% do, about 50% observe and learn. Within the first 2 weeks or so, 2-3 weeks, is develop a game plan, right. Don't assume what you did at the last company that made you successful will be exactly what they expect you to do here. The role may be very different, right? So kind of identify that, develop a game plan, inventory what needs to be done, what skills are needed, right? And you're going to have some of them, but don't expect that you have all of them. And even if you had all of them, there's not enough hours in a day for you to do all of them. So how are you going to get those people and those skills and those capabilities in place? So who's on your staff? Where do you need development? Where do you need to do critical hires? Who do you need to partner with within the organization to get stuff done? So develop those partnerships, right, with peer groups within the organization. And last is kind of understand what the kind of low-hanging fruit is and what your bosses and the firm's priorities are as well. Make sure you're aligned with that, because it maybe some easy things that you can address kind of early on to build credibility. You want to build credibility, you really want to brand yourself and understand the business that you're there to be a partner, not to tell them what to do.
And did you ever come across like you lift up the carpets and all of a sudden there's like a holy shit moment where like, oh my God, this is something I have to deal with, during your initial, several months? Did you come across some urgent matter or things that you have to deal with, or something that you did not know in advance prior to accepting the role?
Yeah. I think you're going to see that. And even if when you're in the role for several months or even several years, there's always going to be the things that pop up and you kind of slap yourself on the forehead and say, you got to be kidding me. That's the way we do that, or that's what we have in place or don't have in place. So I think you just got to be prepared, to address them, right? So kind of step back, try to get other people's opinions, views. How did we get to where we are? What are some of the things that we can do to mitigate the risk, right? I mean, there's always that, you don't necessarily need to eliminate it, right? This whole concept of risk control, self-assessment, all these types of things, right? So try to size up what the risk is. Hopefully keep a risk register, right? Put it on the risk register. Don't hide things. Don't be afraid to expose things to your boss. They need to know that those things exist. And then you just kind of address it with best way to approach it. Can we put some mitigating controls in place and try to handle it, get the right team together, make it a priority. Not everything could be a priority, so kind of risk rate things as well. And then try to limit the risk, right, to bring it down to an acceptable level.
Mm-hmm. And specifically also, I mean, in your role, you obviously had to deal with crisis, right? Mm-hmm. As part of a business continuity plan. And the major crisis happened, back in March, where all of a sudden we realized that we have to get everybody working from home. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How did you approach that crisis? And, what were your, the first, several weeks of that look like for you specifically?
Well, and just using that as an example, I mean, a lot of that was probably driven more from the operations teams, than security to some extent. And surprisingly, I guess most companies do have the ability to work from home, and the way Santander had things set up, that the transition actually worked out relatively smoothly. I think one of the biggest concerns was more around capacity, right? Things going to slow down, but it kind of held up. So part of it is, like with any type of an incident or crisis, you get together a team, right? You have daily calls. You try to get measurements together as to, what are the number of connections, what are the number of connections dropped, how are we doing, where do we need to put more resources in place, either people and or technology, and those types of things. So it kind of goes back to one, understanding solution you have in place, how fragile is it or how robust is it, having the ability to do measurements, right, and the ability to be able to adjust and to work across organizational roles, right? It's the networking guys, it's the infrastructure guys, it's the AD guys, it's the security guys, type of thing, and keep things moving.
And when the company realized that it's not that temporary, that some of the infrastructure they had to put in place in the, for example, application that had to be exposed to the outside world, all of a sudden had became kind of permanent. What happened then? Was there any change in security stance or security controls you had to put in place and so on, or you just were business as usual?
To a large extent, it was business as usual. I mean, we had some other things that happened around the same point in time, and I think it was just more happenstance, and it more had to do with our web-facing assets, right? And there's always bad guys out there, right? So they run these credential validation attacks. Of course, any firm that has that type of stuff in place, and actually they did us a little bit of a favor because they hit us so hard that it kind of showed some weakness in our ability to actually manage the authentication process. No one got through per se, but they were hitting us with so many bad invalid attempts that it identified some areas where we needed to build up infrastructure internally, right, type of thing. So which was good. And that's a good news story, right? Obviously, you don't want necessarily the bad news stories, but the whole idea around stress testing, the whole idea around engineering, right? I mean, I go back to early part of my career at AT&T. Everything there, I mean, things were probably not as quick as they are today with DevOps and such, but a lot had to do with building very robust, very resilient systems, over-engineering things. You never would engineer something to 100% capacity. Even today, you would never do that. But make sure you have a lot of kind of headroom. You understand the operational profile. You understand, where your major faults are, and kind of engineer the system correctly up front. You don't always have the luxury to do that, and things change. But I think that's still a lesson learned. Try to build things in a robust way, kind of using the Japanese model, with Toyota building kind of very, reliable and engines that, work under different tolerances. That's how they got so successful back in the 60s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those engines were breaking down with the little variations and stresses on them, where Toyota engines just kept running and running and running and running.
And during that time, did you have to interface with top executives like board of directors and so on? Were you being asked, like, how are we doing from a security stance? Is there any particular areas that we need to address?
Indirectly, yeah. So when I go back to more there, I had a more direct interface with the board of directors, regular meetings, showing what the major risks were to the organization, both what we're seeing internally, what we're seeing externally, how we're addressing them, those types of things. At Santander, I reported to the US CISO, right? So the US CISO with the CTO would report to the board of directors. So I was kind of preparing materials for them to use. So a lot of it had to do with measurements, as I was saying, right? Of course, a lot of parts of the organization, especially from the IT front, people would be generating daily reports right across the weekends, what did we see today as far as phishing attacks related to COVID? What types of incidents have we had? What type of third parties incidents occurred? So, it was that daily report as to what's going on in the space. And obviously there's always things happen, but what's kind of unique related to COVID, and can you point that out? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's always this notion of aligning, the business goals, with the kind of the security controls and the risk mitigation, right? What were, specifically at financials, what are kind of the main business concerns, and how did you specifically align, what your roles and responsibilities are and the risk you needed to address, with those? And how did you even uncover kind of specific business requirements that the business had to align itself?
You gotta sit down and you gotta talk to the business, right? You really have to understand what are the different businesses you're in, what are the critical businesses and what's critical for each business. I got a couple examples in that space. But most recently, with the threat intel team, right? So sit down and say, okay, what are the applications you have? What are the products? What are the things you're looking at? What are some keywords we can look at to see if anyone's in the kind of dark web chatting about some of the technologies we're planning on using and such. So try to identify what the crown jewels, I guess is a term people use, right, are, and how well they're protected. You don't necessarily have the same size lock to protect every asset, right, in your house. So the same thing's true for the organization. And if I go back a ways, I was talked about AT&T, but I was also saying, Lucent was a spin-off, the Bell Labs type of thing. And there I ran a program called the Crown Jewels program. So it was interesting. So you talk to each of the major business units there and understand what their crown jewels were, right? In one case, it was a person. I won't get into it, but it's a person, So really, okay, that's cool. Another one was like a battery technology and a startup that they were working with. Another one was calibration on ship-to-shore optical free space communication. This is like crazy stuff. And it's like, what are you guys doing? Well, you're shooting light beams from a boat to shore, type of thing. You gotta, take into account the horizon and a boat going up and down and stuff. So there, these were the critical intellectual property that they needed to protect. Was the fact that they could do that versus another company doing that is the reason they would win the bids and, and the pricing data and things like that. So again, kind of understanding the business, understanding what's critical to the business, what actually generates revenue for them, right? And the things you need to protect.
And, so part of that process of protecting the crown jewels, you have to look at what's out there from an innovation perspective with cybersecurity, right? So potentially you can align maybe some new technologies that are emerging and better protect the business. How do you foster that innovation and keep abreast of it? As you know, there's thousands of vendors out there, and I'm sure somebody in your position get their LinkedIn like chat knocked a couple of times a day. So how do you keep abreast of that and potentially be familiar with some of the new tech that's coming down the pipe?
Yeah, that's an area that it's a good trait, I think, as far as Don Aliberti as a professional, but it's also a bad trait. You got to be a little bit careful with that. You could be spending so much time kind of what they call swimming toward the next shiny object type of thing. So you think you need to step back, right? And there's been a number of frameworks that have been developed within the last few years, right? The NIST is one of the most popular ones. So if you can look there and kind of understand where you are from a maturity across different types of controls and where you may have some weaknesses, and maybe that's where some of the technologies you should be looking at are where those weaknesses are, like maybe around insider threat program, maybe some other types of technologies, right? And what I've always tried to do is try to take a kind of two-pronged approach. One is, what do we do today and do we do it well, right? And can we measure it and can we kind of improve on it, just kind of continuous improvement cycle type of stuff. But at the same time, just don't completely focus on that. Try to pull some assets, some budget out and say, okay, what are the things, where do we want to be a year, 2 years from now? What are some of the things that are going to do things very differently for us, right? Again, able to help us do some sort of step function as far as improvement, as far as automation and such, and put together a pilot program, a skunk work or something like that, with at least one project, if not two or three, you know. And and I did that at some companies, right? So you start looking at the deception technology, you start looking at breach attack simulation is an area that I'm kind of excited about. I think there's some good companies out there that are able to measure how well you're really protecting about things right now, as opposed to a once a year kind of pen test type of scenario. So I think you just got to pull stuff out and make sure you got some folks that are looking. And again, I'm getting crazy with the cliches, but the Wayne Gretzky thing, right? You skate toward not the puck, but where the puck's headed, right? Type of thing. So you try to introduce those, and maybe every year and a half or so, you introduce one, right? You try it in a small part of the organization. You kind of iron it out, you get it working well, and then you can spread it, across the other regions and the other parts of the organization.
So you keep coming back, which I find fascinating, specifically that you seems to be very analytic, like in a sense that you like to measure, right? Mm-hmm. And you put in that frame of like, how do you measure risk? How do you measure success? And so in your role, how did you frame that? Like, what was kind of your your selection or criteria that you decided to review some of these successes and where the projects are and where you are in terms of the security stance? What type of measurements did you typically use?
Yeah, no, that's a tricky one. I'm not sure anyone, a lot of people talk about, what's the appropriate level for board reporting, right? How detailed, what are the measurements and such. And I'm not sure I've seen any two that look alike. There are some stuff around that, right, through Gartner and things like that. But a lot of it kind of ties back to what are your major risks to the business, and what is your ability to mitigate it, right? And where do you think you sit, right, within that quadrant, right? This is a major risk, and this is a limited ability to mitigate it, right? So you're sitting up here in that bad quadrant type of thing. Mm-hmm. So you try to address some of those type of concerns, and some of it has to do with what's available to report, right? The tooling that you have in place. But as you introduce new programs, you try to look and understand how they're instrumented and what you can kind of pull out of them. And one of the things I've observed, and I'm not sure I've done the best with it, but I've tried in some cases, is we often always record and report the bad things that happen, right? The breaches, the number of clicks on bad, phishing emails and those types of things. But we put all these controls in place, and all of them are pumping away, and they're stopping, 98%, 90-something% of the noise type of stuff. And most organizations don't necessarily pull that data out of the tools and kind of give themselves credit for it, because this is showing you what type of capabilities, effectiveness, kind of return on investment of the different technologies. So I think, having the ability to say, this is what we're getting hit with, and these three things came through this quarter, but these are the 300,000 or 3 million that we stopped. So if we had this tool in place, imagine the mess we would have been in. Now let's look at those three and why did they get through, right? And what can we do, to tweak the configuration or to add an additional control, or maybe it's a people issue, or, or something. And then you kind of do root cause analysis. And you try to, tighten things up and improve things over time. But we don't often give ourselves enough credit for, keeping the lights on. No pun intended with the outages, right? The fact that the lights are always working. Now everyone's all mad at the electric company because they don't have power.
Yeah, and I think what you just described is a big data problem, right? Because these SIMs and all of these tools, they spit out so much information, and typically in a disjointed way, it's very hard to to process all that and then make the sense of it. But I think there are new technologies out there that potentially have the ability to look at it down the road. And coming back to the kind of the innovation process and kind of new projects that you're responsible for, how do you combine new technologies with older technologies. I think that's one of the kind of the real big problems, that any technology you acquire today, most of the time it's never standalone. It has to be connected to either a legacy system or combine it with some additional, workflows that were around for years. So how do you, how do you then, get an off-the-shelf software or, solution out there, and then you combine that with something that's been around for ages? Especially some of these financial institutions, I'm sure they have, legacy systems been around for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, some of the younger companies are probably a major advantage there because they have less technical debt, right? And they're able to kind of use some of the more modern approaches. But it's always challenging for companies that have been established and have a lot of older technologies in place. I think part of it has to do with kind of early on, when you're looking to introduce the technology, to have the right business case and understand how you're going to use it, how you're going to operationalize it, who's going to manage it, who's going to maintain it over time. Sometimes organizations will put something new in place. It's cool, and it kind of works well because you get a lot of professional services, and you get it up and running. And then the one person that was the kind of zealot behind it, that they wanted to put it in place, decides to take a job at another company, and then the thing gets abandoned, and it doesn't necessarily working as effectively as it was originally because it's not being managed. So kind of going back to understanding the full life cycle of the product, including APIs and what interfaces you need with other products and how you can use it effectively. So I think it's good to probably have less vendors and more vendors, and have more strategic vendors where you kind of can sit down with them and say, these are the tool sets that we're using of you. How are we doing? And they can, they're the experts on it, and they're saying, you guys, you haven't touched this in a while. Did you know you could do this over here? And, you kind of have those meetings periodically on a once a quarter, twice a year type of stuff to make sure that you're leveraging things the best of your ability, as opposed to just turning it on and assuming that everything's working, which goes back to the breach and attack simulations, right? You assume things are working until they didn't work. And you say, why didn't it work? Because it wasn't configured. That feature was in the product. Yeah, but it was never configured, right? Why was it configured? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That guy left 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And so you mentioned breach simulation, you mentioned automation. So if you had a crystal ball and look at what technology would dominate in the next several years, there's a lot of buzzwords out there that have been thrown out, like machine learning, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. There's a bunch of them. When you're in your experience, and just kind of if you had that kind of vision to see what's going to dominate, what would you put your money on?
Yeah, I like continuous testing, whatever, gives you those types of metrics and that type of capability. I think any new company and existing companies eventually are getting their feet wet, and a lot more than their feet wet in most cases, around the cloud, right? So some of the really good technology around securing the cloud, some of it is being developed by the cloud vendors themselves, right? So it's not agnostic across the different multi-cloud providers. I think people need to be, unless they just want to put all their bets on one of the providers, I think they need to step back and look for kind of monitoring the cloud environment. How do you tighten up the configurations, the access controls, the use of keys and certificates and things like that, and come up with solutions that can be used across all the 3 different major kind of cloud providers. I think that's an interesting area.
So you mentioned that cloud security is one, and from your perspective, do you feel that we're going to turn into 100% cloud eventually, or you think it's going to be just a hybrid, and we'll continue doing that, for the next foreseeable future?
Yeah, my gut response to that is that it's like a lot of things, it's the pendulum, right? So I mean, we're swinging now that people are adopting the cloud, and eventually something bad's going to maybe happen or something, and people are going to pull back a little. So I think there'll always be kind of a mix between the two. I think a lot of it's going to be driven by how a company can better differentiate itself and be more effective, right? if everyone's using the cloud and everyone's using it at the same level, how are we going to be able to trade faster? How are we going to be able to do this better? And someone's going to say, well, we got to do it ourselves, maybe, right? And then you try to create that differentiation and you build something that's a bit different, or maybe it's a hybrid, right? That you do the part of the computing in the cloud, but you store the data locally, or vice versa. So yeah, I think it's as far as I can see, I would imagine it's going to be a mix.
So, and from talking about clouds and specifically for financials, how do you think that the different compliance and regulatory environment that's always changing for financials, would affect how we store information, how we deal with security in general, and just affect the way we these financials operate on a regular basis, and how they interface with their customers. And by the way, guys, if you want to ask a couple questions before we wrap up, then please feel free to put that in the chat if you're done. So go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, and I was going to say with this one is I think most companies, you need to keep an eye on where the regulators are going, right? And I think most regulators are kind of marching toward the same net set of controls, net effect, type of thing. So I know the guys at SIFMA were looking for harmonization across the regulations. Tell us what the hell we need to do, and we'll do it. Whether it's hard, whether it's easy, or whatever, as opposed to getting 6 or 7 different messages. So I think partnering with organizations like SIFMA, right, to try to understand where the regulations are going, to stay on top of that, to do harmonization around that, I believe.
So for those who are not familiar with SIFMA, maybe you can describe what that organization.
That's a good question. I don't even know what it stands for.
No, that's okay. What are they responsible for?
Yeah, it's a organization, right? That's kind of you become a member as a financial institution, right? And the idea behind it is to work collectively on addressing major issues related to financials, right? Something called safe harbor, something that came out of there, right? What happened if all the data disappeared tomorrow?
Right.
Attack type of thing. How are we going to recover? Right, that type of stuff. And there it is, Security Industries and Financial Markets Association. Thank you.
Well, there's so many acronyms that you can't possibly keep track of all of those.
Yeah. So from a regulatory perspective, that there's that piece, and then the other thing from I'm not sure everyone here is necessarily on the buyer side. I mean, from a company that's building products, I mean, you should stay on top of those things as well. I'm going to go back probably 6 years. I had a fellow that I worked with at Citi, left, and he went to Box to become their CISO. And they came in to talk to us when I first joined Nomura. And the founder of Box, can't remember the name off the top of my head, but he had really cool, colorful sneakers on. And he's very, very smart. And before anyone even asked any questions, he had all the answers to a lot of the things around compliance, around regulatory, and those types of stuff. So he anticipated, because he understood what the problems or the obstacles to getting into a particular market may be, and anticipated those, and had slides and had answers, good answers around how they address it and how you can feel more comfortable about adopting their technology. So I think that's important too, right? The vendors need to come up with the right set of capabilities within the product.
And kind of last but not least, I'd like to ask you, if you can share, personal, professional wins and for you, and then maybe a loss, something you can reveal that maybe, during your careers did not go quite as expected.
Oh, okay. Let me think for a minute. I think from a win, I'll just keep it at a real high level, is kind of the position, jumping into security. I think that was a good move, right? I mean, someone told me to do it, so I'm not sure I had a choice, but the fact that the security is still, viable, probably viable, in 20, 30 years from now as well. So it's an interesting area. It's always changing. So I think that was a win as far as choosing a career. From a loss perspective, I'll kind of keep it, again, personal, is early part of my career. Well, a lot of this they didn't even call it cybersecurity. I'm not even sure the word cyber kind of existed right in the late 80s. Didn't come out till the mid 90s, late 90s. But not taking more chances early in my career, right, with stuff. I worked on a project at AT&T to secure the network as part of this whole initiative. And we built some pretty cool internal tools. And eventually we replaced them with commercial tools that did the same thing. But I think we had at least a 2 or 3 year head start on some of the commercial tools. And myself and another guy did approach AT&T about creating a commercial version of it. And we were told that it was part of a quality initiative. It differentiated AT&T, that, that they didn't want to do that. I stuck with AT&T for another, 5 or 6 years. He left, he went to Netscape. This is how long ago it was, right? That's one of the early employees there. So, if I knew what I knew now at that point, I would have just said, let's, the name was John. John, let's get, a couple other guys and let's start our own thing. We know what we need to do here, and I didn't, but whatever. Like a lot of things. I think we had this conversation, David, right? I mean, part of it has to do with, it's a million ideas out there, right? It's really around who takes the chance, who executes well, right? Type of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And hindsight is always 2020. I met somebody who used to work at Bell Labs as well, and at the time, the founder of a major, I'm not going to name the name of a major cloud security company that's worth several $1 billion on the stock exchange today, came to them and basically just shared the idea. It was just an idea without any, and he didn't give it a time of day, right? It was just like, it's like it's just busy doing other stuff. And then this is something that he always remembers as a kind of personal loss for them, because they pass on an incredible opportunity of a lifetime to join a major success story at the ground floor. And it's just an unassuming guy shows up to his office, trying to book a meeting with him and toying with the idea. But again, hindsight is 2020. Yeah. There's a lot of these things that happen and never go anywhere. But thanks for sharing that. I mean, much appreciated. So kind of last but not least, maybe share like a positive experience that you had from, this whole pandemic, COVID-19. If there's anything that's positive. Some people said, we spend more time with the family. Some people see it positive and negative at the same time. I don't know if this something you can share that kind of impacted you.
You hit what I would have, what I'm going to talk about. Yeah, I mean, I have 2 children, right? So my daughter's 28. She's been living in Manhattan for the last 7 years, something like that. And we see her a lot, but not that often, because and my son graduated from college last year, and he's still living at home with us. But I think it was March 12th, that Thursday, I picked her up on the ferry, and she came home and started working from home. So she's very much a fitness person. So she runs little exercise classes in the garage. We've been eating dinner together and stuff. The 2 young adults, 2 kids, 4 years apart, probably never spent that much time together as they do now. So I see them forming, kind of strong bonds and relationships. They probably always had, but I see it more so directly. So I think all the family time has actually been a pretty cool thing. I don't think there would have been an opportunity for that to happen.
Yeah, that's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Yeah. So Don, thank you very much for the time. Much appreciated for providing a glimpse of your, professional and personal background. It's been enlightening. Where can people find you if somebody wants to follow you and keep in touch?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at me on LinkedIn is probably the best way, or maybe even through the Meetup portal as well. I think LinkedIn, I look at LinkedIn almost every day. So I probably use that just as much as my personal emails. I think that works out well. So yeah, just send over. I already got a few invites leading up to this that I accepted. So, feel free to reach out to me. I mean, I'll share whatever I can with folks to help them out. And, it's always good to network, to bounce ideas off of people. So.
Yeah, fantastic. What's the saying, if you on the top floor, make sure they to send the elevator down.
Oh, here you go. Okay, good. I'll see you.
Yeah,
I'll
if
see
you're
you.
already using some cliches, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then I do hope to have the opportunity to maybe meet you in person in the city once it's all over, and grab a couple beers afterwards. After the monthly events once they resume. So
Great.
looking forward to that. So Don, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining, and looking forward to seeing you at the next event. Appreciate it all.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.